The year is 1200 BCE. Most of the known world operates on barter. A farmer trades grain for pottery. A blacksmith exchanges tools for cloth. Value flows only when physical goods change hands. But in a narrow strip of coastline along the eastern Mediterranean, something radically different is happening. In the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, merchants are building fortunes not on what they own, but on what they promise to pay. They're inventing credit, and in doing so, they're about to create the first true trading empire in human history. Today, we carry plastic cards that let us spend money we don't have. We take loans, mortgages, and lines of credit for granted. But what few people understand is that all of it traces back to a civilization that most have never heard of. The Phoenicians didn't just trade goods across the Mediterranean. They created the financial infrastructure that made long-distance commerce possible. They invented the letter of credit, the promissory note, and the concept of reputation as collateral. And for nearly 1,000 years, they dominated global trade not through military conquest, but through financial innovation. But there's a darker truth buried in this story. The same system that made them rich also made them vulnerable. The same trust networks that enabled their rise would eventually trigger their collapse. And the lessons they learned about credit, risk, and systemic failure are as relevant in 2025 as they were 3,000 years ago. The Phoenicians never called themselves Phoenicians. That name came from the Greeks, derived from the word phoenix, meaning purple. The reference was to the most valuable commodity these people produced, a deep purple dye extracted from murex sea snails found along their coast. To produce just 1 gram of this dye required crushing roughly 10,000 snails. The resulting color was so rare, so vivid, and so expensive that only royalty could afford it. Purple became synonymous with power, but purple dye was just the beginning. The Phoenicians occupied a thin coastal strip in what is now Lebanon and Syria. Behind them rose mountains. Ahead lay the sea. They had limited farmland, no major rivers, and few natural resources beyond cedarwood and those precious snails. Geography forced them to become traders. By 1500 BCE, Phoenician ships were already ranging across the Mediterranean, trading cedar, textiles, glassware, and that legendary purple dye for grain, metals, and luxury goods from Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and beyond. The problem with long-distance trade in the ancient world was simple. How do you exchange value when you can't carry enough physical goods to make the journey worthwhile? Ships had limited cargo space. Gold and silver were heavy. Goods were perishable. And every voyage carried enormous risk. Pirates prowled the seas. Storms sank vessels. Political instability could close ports overnight. The merchant who invested everything in a single shipment could lose it all to a single unlucky voyage. So Phoenician merchants developed a solution that would change economics forever. Instead of carrying physical payment, they carried promises. A merchant in Tyre would load a ship with cedar and purple dye, sail to Egypt, and trade those goods not for immediate payment in gold or grain, but for a written promise that the Egyptian buyer would pay later, or that payment would be honored at another port, or that goods of equivalent value would be delivered to a third party elsewhere. These weren't just IUs. They were transferable instruments of credit that could be traded, split, combined, and used as currency themselves. The innovation was staggering. For the first time in history, value could move faster than physical good. A merchant could finance 10 voyages simultaneously by extending credit, rather than waiting for one shipment to sell before funding the next. The Phoenician economy became a web of obligations, promises, and trust networks stretching across the entire Mediterranean basin. They were operating a proto-banking system centuries before coins would even be invented. By 1000 BCE, Phoenician city-states like Tyre and Sidon had become the richest in the known world. Their fleets dominated maritime trade from Gibraltar to the Levant. They established colonies across the Mediterranean, including Carthage in North Africa, which would eventually become a superpower in its own right. Phoenician merchants didn't just sell goods. They sold credit, liquidity, and financial services. They became the bankers of the ancient world, but the system had a fatal flaw built into its foundation. It ran entirely on trust. In a credit-based economy, your reputation is your most valuable asset. If merchants believed you would honor your promises, they would extend credit. If you defaulted, you were finished, not just with that one merchant, but with the entire network. Information about defaults spread quickly through Phoenician trading communities. A merchant who failed to pay in Tyre would find himself blacklisted in Carthage, Cyprus, and Crete. The Phoenicians created what we would now call a credit rating system, enforced not by courts or governments, but by the collective memory of a merchant class that valued reputation above all else. This trust network was incredibly powerful. It allowed Phoenician merchants to operate with leverage ratios that would make modern bankers nervous. A merchant might promise to deliver goods worth 10 times what he actually owned, confident that he could fulfill those obligations through future trades. As long as trade kept flowing, as long as ships kept arriving, as long as harvests didn't fail and wars didn't disrupt ports, the system worked beautifully. But it was also fragile. Catastrophically fragile. The first cracks appeared not in Phoenicia itself, but in the broader Mediterranean world. Around 1200 BCE, just as Phoenician trade was reaching new heights, a series of catastrophic events known as the Bronze Age collapse devastated the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. Egyptian power contracted. Major cities were destroyed. Trade routes were severed. Entire civilizations simply vanished from the historical record. The exact cause of the Bronze Age collapse is still debated by historians. Some point to climate change and drought. Others to invasions by mysterious sea peoples. Still others to internal rebellions, economic disruption, or systems collapse. But whatever the cause, the effect on Phoenician credit networks was devastating. When your entire economy depends on long-distance trade, and half your trading partners suddenly cease to exist, the web of credit begins to unravel. Phoenician merchants who had extended credit to Egyptian buyers or Greek traders found themselves holding worthless promises. Ships loaded with goods sailed to ports that no longer existed. Debts went unpaid. The carefully constructed trust networks began to break down. Merchants who had been operating on high leverage discovered that when multiple counterparties default simultaneously, you can't trade your way out. The cascade began. But here's where the Phoenician story gets interesting. They survived, while empires around them collapsed. Phoenician city-states adapted. They shifted trade routes. They found new partners. They wrote off bad debts and rebuilt their credit networks with more conservative terms. The survivors learned a brutal lesson. In a credit-based economy, systemic shocks don't just reduce wealth, they destroy the trust infrastructure that makes wealth creation possible. Recovery isn't about rebuilding ships or warehouses. It's about rebuilding confidence. By 900 BCE, Phoenician trade was booming again. The city of Tyre, perched on a rocky island just off the coast, became one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world. King Hiram, the first of Tyre, famously supplied cedar and craftsmen to King Solomon for the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, a partnership recorded in both the Hebrew Bible and Phoenician records. Tyrian merchants established a network of trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean, creating what historians now call the Phoenician thalassocracy, a sea-based commercial empire. They refined their credit instruments. Phoenician merchants developed early forms of the bill of exchange, where a merchant in one city could draw on funds held by a partner in another city, enabling complex triangular trades without physically moving gold or silver. They created merchant partnerships with clearly defined profit-sharing agreements, an early form of equity financing. They even developed maritime insurance concepts, where groups of merchants would pool risk across multiple voyages, spreading the danger of any single shipwreck across the entire network. The Phoenicians also made another contribution that would prove even more transformative than credit itself. Around 1050 BCE, they developed the first widely used phonetic alphabet. Previous writing systems like Egyptian hieroglyphics or Mesopotamian cuneiform required thousands of characters. The Phoenician alphabet had just 22 letters, each representing a simple sound. Anyone could learn to read and write in weeks rather than years. This wasn't just a cultural innovation, it was an economic revolution. Why? Because credit systems require record keeping. In a barter economy, you don't need to write anything down. The trade is immediate and complete. But in a credit economy, you need to track who owes what to whom, when payments are due, what goods were promised, and which merchants have honored their obligation. The Phoenician alphabet made it possible for ordinary merchants, not just elite scribes, to maintain detailed financial records. It democratized commerce. Every ship captain, every warehouse manager, every merchant's agent could now read contracts, record transactions, and verify accounts. The spread of the Phoenician alphabet, which would eventually evolve into Greek, Latin, and most modern Western alphabets, was intimately tied to the spread of Phoenician commercial practices. Where Phoenician merchants went, their writing system followed. And with it, their methods of conducting business based on written promises, rather than physical exchange. But the success contained the seeds of future danger. The more successful the Phoenician credit system became, the more other powers wanted to control it. By the 8th century BCE, Phoenician city-states faced growing pressure from rising empires. The Assyrians, building a massive military empire in Mesopotamia, looked at the wealth flowing through Tyre and Sidon and wanted tribute. The Phoenicians, lacking large armies, paid. They remained independent but subordinate, using their commercial skills to profit from serving larger powers. When Babylon conquered Assyria, the Phoenicians shifted allegiance and traded with Babylon. When Persia conquered Babylon, the Phoenicians joined the Persian Empire and provided the naval forces that enabled Persian expansion. This strategy worked for centuries. The Phoenicians maintained their commercial networks by adapting to changing political circumstances. They were pragmatic, not ideological. They served whoever held power, as long as they could continue trading. Their cities remained wealthy, their merchants remained influential, but they were slowly losing independence, slowly becoming service providers to empires rather than masters of their own fate. The beginning of the end came in 332 BCE. Alexander the Great, conquering his way through the Persian Empire, arrived at the gates of Tyre. The Tyrians, confident in their island fortress, refused to submit. They had walls 150 feet high. They controlled the sea. They had withstood sieges before. Alexander responded by building a causeway from the mainland to the island, a massive engineering project that took 7 months and transformed Tyre's geography forever. When his forces finally breached the walls, they killed 8,000 Tyrians and sold 30,000 more into slavery. Tyre never recovered its former glory, but Tyre's fall wasn't really about walls or sieges. It was about the fundamental vulnerability of a commercial empire in a world increasingly dominated by military powers. The Phoenicians had built their wealth on networks, credit, and trust. But when empires clash, when armies march, when cities burn, trust networks collapse faster than physical infrastructure. A destroyed warehouse can be rebuilt. A shattered reputation takes generations to restore. A dead merchant's credit network dies with him. The Phoenician colonies survived longer than the homeland. Carthage, founded around 814 BCE by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, grew into a major power in its own right. The Carthaginians inherited Phoenician commercial practices, including their sophisticated credit systems and long-distance trading networks. They dominated Western Mediterranean trade for centuries, challenging Rome itself for supremacy. But even Carthage ultimately fell, destroyed by Rome in 146 BCE after 3 brutal wars. When historians assess the Phoenician legacy, they often focus on the alphabet, the purple dye, or the far-flung colonies. But the deeper legacy is financial. The Phoenicians proved that you could build enormous wealth, not through agricultural surplus or military conquest, but through financial innovation and commercial networks. They demonstrated that credit, properly managed, could multiply economic activity far beyond what barter or even hard currency could achieve. They showed that reputation and trust could function as forms of capital, just as valuable as gold or land. They also demonstrated the limits and dangers of credit-based systems. When the Bronze Age collapse disrupted trade networks, the Phoenician credit system nearly collapsed with it. When military empires absorbed Phoenician cities, their commercial autonomy gradually eroded. When Alexander destroyed Tyre, he didn't just conquer a city, he destroyed a node in a credit network that had functioned for centuries. The ripple effects spread across the Mediterranean as merchants who had relied on Tyrian letters of credit suddenly found their instruments worthless. The parallels to modern financial systems are impossible to miss. We live in a world where credit vastly exceeds physical wealth, where reputation and trust networks enable global commerce, where financial innovations like derivatives and credit default swaps multiply the velocity of capital. We've built an economy that, like the Phoenician system, runs on promises and depends on confidence. When that confidence breaks, when trust networks fail, when systemic shocks hit multiple nodes simultaneously, the cascade can be devastating. The 2008 financial crisis followed a pattern the Phoenicians would have recognized. Lehman Brothers wasn't brought down by a lack of physical assets. It was brought down by a collapse in trust. When counterparties stopped believing Lehman could honor its obligations, when the credit network that connected it to thousands of other institutions began to fail, the firm collapsed in days. The entire global financial system nearly followed, not because wealth had disappeared, but because the trust infrastructure that makes credit work had been damaged. Every major financial crisis since the Phoenicians has followed similar dynamics. The 1929 crash, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2010 European debt crisis. The pattern repeats. Credit expands during good times, networks of obligation grow complex and highly leveraged. A shock hits, trust breaks, and the cascade begins. We haven't transcended the limitations the Phoenicians discovered 3,000 years ago. We've just built the same system on a vastly larger, more interconnected scale, which makes the potential for catastrophic failure that much greater. The Phoenicians also understood something that modern economies sometimes forget. Credit is not wealth. Credit is a claim on future wealth. It's a promise that future production, future trade, future economic activity will generate enough value to honor present obligations. When too many promises are made, when leverage becomes too extreme, when the gap between credit and actual productive capacity grows too large, the system becomes unstable. The Phoenicians learned this during the Bronze Age collapse. We relearn it every few decades when bubbles burst and credit crunches freeze economies. There's a final lesson buried in the Phoenician story, one that's often overlooked. The Phoenicians never built a unified empire. They remained a network of independent city-states, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but always connected by trade, culture, and those crucial credit relationships. This decentralized structure was both a strength and a weakness. It made them adaptable and resilient in some ways. When one city faced trouble, others could compensate. When political conditions in one region deteriorated, merchants could shift to other markets. The network could route around damage. But it also meant they could never marshal the collective military power to defend themselves against centralized empires. When Assyria, Babylon, Persia, or Macedon came calling, individual Phoenician cities made individual calculations about resistance or submission. There was no Phoenician emperor to rally collective defense, no unified army to repel invaders. Their strength in commerce became a weakness in war. Modern global finance faces a similar tension. The international financial system is decentralized, a network of banks, central banks, regulators, and institutions spanning hundreds of countries. This creates resilience and efficiency. It also creates coordination problems. When crisis hits, as in 2008, there's no global financial authority to impose order. Countries act in their own interests. Coordination is difficult. Collective action problems abound. The flexibility that makes the system productive in normal times makes it chaotic during crises. The Phoenician commercial empire lasted roughly 1,000 years, from around 1500 BCE to 539 BCE. When Persia absorbed the city-states, or to 332 BCE, if we date it to Alexander's conquest of Tyre, or even to 146 BCE if we include Carthage as the final Phoenician civilization. That's extraordinary longevity. Compare it to modern corporations. Of the original companies in the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1896, only one, General Electric, survived to 2018 before being dropped. Most companies last decades, not centuries. Most financial systems experience major crises every generation. The Phoenicians succeeded for so long because they adapted, because they valued pragmatism over ideology, because they understood that commerce requires trust, and that trust requires honoring obligations even when it's inconvenient. They failed ultimately because trust networks, no matter how well constructed, are vulnerable to violence and political power. You can't negotiate credit terms with an army burning your city. Today, 3,000 years after Phoenician merchants invented the letter of credit, we carry their legacy in every credit card transaction, every loan, every derivative, every promise to pay at a future date. We've built a global economy on the foundation they laid. The idea that value can be created through trusted promises, that credit can multiply productivity, that networks of obligation can span continents and enable commerce that physical barter never could. But we've also inherited their vulnerabilities. Our financial system, like theirs, depends on confidence. When confidence breaks, when trust evaporates, when credit networks begin to unwind, the collapse can be swift and brutal. We've seen it in 1929, in 2008, in every financial panic that has seized markets across history. The technology has changed, the scale has grown, the speed has accelerated, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. The Phoenicians discovered that credit is power. They also discovered that credit is risk. The same system that enabled them to dominate Mediterranean trade for a millennium made them vulnerable to systemic shocks they couldn't control. They built the first trading empire on borrowed time and learned that all credit, ultimately, must be repaid or defaulted. There is no third option. If there's a warning in the Phoenician story for our own time, it's this. The more complex and leveraged a credit system becomes, the more fragile it is to shock. The more interconnected the trust networks, the faster contagion spreads when trust fails. And no amount of financial innovation can eliminate the fundamental truth that credit is a promise about the future. And the future is always uncertain. The Phoenicians are gone. Their cities are ruins or tourist destinations. Their language is dead. Their purple dye industry ended 2,000 years ago. But their financial innovations live on in every economy on Earth. We are all, in a sense, still trading on Phoenician terms, using instruments of credit they invented, dealing with the same tensions between trust and risk they grappled with in those ancient port cities. And like them, we face the question: how much complexity can a credit system sustain before it becomes too fragile to survive the next shock? The Phoenicians never solved that problem. Neither have we.